George Orwell, Life, Works, Legacy. This is the first lecture of a series of talks that will be devoted to those topics in the career of George Orwell. We will be devoting attention in selected topics in the next several lectures to the short and extraordinary life that George Orwell led, the major works in fiction and nonfiction that he wrote during his 46 years, and the even more astonishing afterlife that has transpired since his death in 1950. Indeed, in the 6 decades since Orwell has passed away, he has continued to arouse both public interest and scholarly attention to an almost unprecedented level. He is arguably not only the most famous writer of the 20th century, but the most influential writer who has ever lived, given the circulation globally in numerous languages of his vast collection of catchwords. Big Brother's watching, Newspeak, Doublethink, and on and on and on. And not only from 1984, even from Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Let us look then at the life, the works, and the afterlife, the legacy. We'll be following these lectures with interviews that will be focused on these 3 areas, as well as on different subjects that raise vital issues connected with these topics from a range of perspectives. Some will be more specialized, some will be quite general, but they will be devoted to all 3 areas. What then of Orwell's life? To be a famous author, he once told a childhood friend, Shinta Buddington, his first girlfriend, was a lifelong dream. However, not even George Orwell, the prophet of 1984, could possibly have anticipated that within just a few years after his death, he would not only become a famous author with his volumes in a collected edition, but the most famous author of his generation, and indeed of the previous century. And indeed not only his collected works in publication today, but a magisterial 21-volume complete works of George Orwell, both in cloth-bound and in paperback, brilliantly edited by Peter Davison, arguably the dean of Orwell studies, and certainly the great editor and bibliographer to whom so many of us are indebted. So then, in that respect, at least in terms of his literary ambitions, a life fulfilled. He was born in Bengal, India, son of a civil servant in June 1903. At the age of slightly beyond 1, he was brought by his mother back to England, while his father remained until retirement, with only occasional postings back to England. until Orwell was well into his teens. Orwell attended a prep school that prepared one to enter the elite public schools of England. And eventually he excelled at this prep school academically, insofar as he was able to gain admission both to Winchester and ultimately to Eton, the most elite prep school of England. He excelled academically, but he suffered enormously emotionally and perhaps even psychologically at a school named St. Cyprian's, about which he wrote one of his most moving, painful, and well-known essays, a nod to William Blake, Such were the joys. And such were the miseries of his experience there. So there's a sad, resigned tone throughout this essay. Failure, failure, failure. That was the deepest conviction I carried away. And he said it took him more than 3 decades to work through those feelings of failure. But ultimately, he seems to have done so. After graduating from Eton, he made the unusual decision, unique among writers of his generation, not to attend university, Oxford, Cambridge, any of the others, but rather to enter the Indian Imperial Police. That is, in the footsteps of his father, but not with a posting to the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, India, but rather to a backwater, Burma, where he did have some relatives, distant relatives living. But otherwise there was no connection whatsoever. He spent 5 dismal years there as a policeman in the Indian Imperial Service, searching for himself, wondering about his future, experimenting with being a writer, until he finally decided to throw it all up, as he said, and return back home for good, and to become a writer. But the decision to become a writer was by no means equivalent to becoming George Orwell. He spent 5 difficult years writing more than a dozen essays, 2 apparently full-length novels that he discarded, and engaging in some self-punishing activity as a member of what he called the lower upper middle class, in living among the poor and the destitute, both at the East End of India, of London, and also down and out in Paris and London, which became the title of his first nonfiction book published in January 1933, Down and Out in Paris and London. It received excellent reviews, and it launched him, not only as a writer of serious work, but with a new name and a new identity. Eric Blair, born in 1903, became George Orwell 30 years later. That was the pen name that he adopted and which he gradually grew into as a kind of new self. The private life continued to be Eric, but the public life that increasingly became the man's identity was George Orwell. George, the patron saint of England, Orwell a small river in Surrey, near where he grew up. Orwell continued to write reviews and, above all, reportage and documentary work in the 1930s. Probably the two best-known books that he wrote, The Road to Wigan Pier, 1937, Homage to Catalonia, 1938, typify the best work that he did in the 30s. The first was, in a sense, a continuation of Down in Paris in London, also nonfiction, but this time traveling to the north of England, to the Midlands, and investigating the situation of the unemployed, and in particular the coal miners. And writing not only a report of their condition, but also a personal testament as to how he had become a socialist and what he believed to be the vulnerabilities of socialism when it came to middle-class intellectuals such as himself and the attempt to establish solidarity with the working class. At the same time during this decade, he wrote 3 well-regarded novels of realistic fiction. The first, owing very much to his experience as the Indian imperial policeman in Asia, called Burmese Days, a kind of companion to E.M. Forster's famous Passage to India, the 2 great works dealing with Asia in fiction of the 1920s and 30s. And then, subsequent to that, 3 other novels, 2 somewhat forgettable: A Clergyman's Daughter, 1934, Keep the Expeditioner Flying, 1935, followed by a much better novel coming up for air in 1939, which closed its decade. Unfortunately, the last novel was published just weeks before the outbreak of World War II, and so never received the kind of attention it might have otherwise gained. These 4 works of fiction, 3 dealing with the domestic experience and 1 abroad, covered his fiction attempts during the decade, and unexpectedly would also represent his final attempt to write conventional, realistic fiction. Thereafter, he turned much more to the essay and to experimental works that could be called, in the phrase of Alex Wordling, didactic fantasies. That is, The Fable Animal Farm and The Horrific Anti-Utopia in 1984. Those were his activities during the 1940s. In the year 1940, he published an essay collection, Inside the Whale, in which he wrote, among other things, about the novelist Charles Dickens and Henry Miller, probably the most controversial writer of the time. Orwell reviewed in a long essay, Tropic of Cancer, and talked about Miller's political passivity during this Marxist decade of the 1930s, this low, dishonest decade, as W.H. Auden had put it. Miller had opted out of politics altogether, and according to Orwell, safeguarded himself inside the blubbery suit of armor of a whale. publishing this collection, Orwell accepted a position as BBC talk producer for India as his contribution to the war effort. He stayed in this job for 2 years, not entirely satisfied with it, before accepting a much more attractive offer to become the literary editor of Tribune, a small left-wing newspaper that coincided with his own independent radical politics. Orwell kept this job for another 2 years, and immediately after that published the book that would constitute his literary breakthrough, Animal Farm. Published in August 1945, just as World War II was ending, Animal Farm, in effect, became the first salvo of a literary political nature from Western intellectuals in the Cold War. The book had been rejected by more than 20 publishers in Britain and in the USA, including Faber and Faber, whose reader was T.S. Eliot. Ironically, if Orwell had published the book when he had finished it in February 1944, it might have been swallowed up in the propaganda for Uncle Joe Stalin, who was, of course, our ally in World War II, both Britain and America. As it was, as tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies heated up, or went into a deep freeze, as solidarity of the war effort dissolved with Hitler deposed, Orwell's book was perfectly timed. It became a kind of cultural atom bomb, exploded on the intellectual front. Published just 3 weeks after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And had a perhaps even more enduring, long-term effect in persuading intellectuals and Western policymakers about the nature of Soviet tyranny. This was the little fable that contained so many memorable catchwords about which Orwell has become famous. The most famous of which I've already mentioned, the seventh commandment of animalism. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Orwell was suffering from periodic tuberculosis, and within 2 years of the publication of this book, had to first again seek serious treatment in a sanatorium. He went, however, to the Scottish Hebrides on release to an island, Jura, where he had purchased a home. And it was here that he wrote most of his last great work, 1984. An unforgettable anti-utopia about life in the near future, just 35 years away, the year 1984. Half a lifetime, certainly within the lifetimes of most or many of his readers. Published in June 1949, only 7 months before his unexpected tragic death in January 1950 at the age of 46, 1984 represented his final legacy. However, it was not so much a prophecy of what would happen as a warning against what might happen. In fact, He later wrote a dementi in which he attempted to explain what his intentions had been in order to preclude the possibility of misinterpretation, in which he said, the message is, don't let it happen. It depends on you. And he believed that it could indeed happen here in the English-speaking countries, which was why he named the ruling party under Big Brother in 1984, INGSOC, English Socialism. And the currency that the Empire of Oceania used was dollars, not rubles. So Orwell scatters 1984 with numerous details that apply not only to the USSR, but also to the English-speaking world. It was a critique not only of Stalin's evil empire, but also of the English-speaking world, and in particular the role of intellectuals, even minor intellectuals such as Winston Smith, who works at the Ministry of Truth, and their contribution to distortions of language, perversions of the truth, the willingness to fantasize that 2 + 2 = 5, the corruptions of ideology. The book was published to great acclaim, but it was all too late for Orwell to enjoy. Nonetheless, even until his last days, he was extremely hopeful about surviving. 1984 just happened to be the last book he published. He had other projects, other dreams underway, including the fact that in October 1949, less than 3 months before his end, he remarried. His wife Eileen had died of a tragic operation for a hysterectomy in 1945, while Orwell was abroad as a war correspondent in France and Germany. They had adopted a child at that point that Orwell refused to give up. He continued to care for him himself until he had gone into sanatoria, at which point his sister Avril Blair became the caretaker. In October 1949, Orwell married Sonia Brownell, an editorial assistant under Cyril Connolly at the magazine Horizon, to which Orwell contributed. But it was indeed too late. And Sonia Brownell soon became a widow. Using, by the way, for the rest of her life, the name Sonia Orwell, even though Orwell had never officially adopted it as his own name. Here lies Eric Blair, as Tombstone reads, January 21, 1950, was his hand. But the afterlife is perhaps even more astonishing than was the life. Having discussed the life and the works, let us briefly look at this afterlife. Orwell's oeuvre, especially his last 2 books in 1984 and Animal Farm, have sold in millions of copies. Today, almost 60 million copies of his books have been sold in more than 6 languages. His neologisms, Big Brother is watching you, newspeak, doublethink, thought crime, and on, are known not only in language, but in several others, as I discovered during my lectures in Germany in the 1990s, when even students in East Germany, who had never read his work and had been banned, verboten, in communist East Germany throughout their lives, were familiar with it through headlines that had been using Orwell's language to attack Western capitalism. Der große Bruder sieht dich an. Big Brother is watching you. Orwell's works, again particularly Animal Farm and some of the essays, have been widely anthologized and part of the curriculum, both in the English and the German-speaking world. Required books that are used for advanced placement testing in the US, for O-level and A-level examinations in Great Britain, and for comparable examinations in Germany. This is part of Orwell's extraordinary afterlife, which was assisted in the 1950s by the fact that the CIA, under Howard Hunt, had bought up the rights to Animal Farm in 1984 and some of Orwell's less-known works from his widow, Sonia Orwell. Movie releases in the 1950s of Animal Farm 1984 were distributed throughout the West and in the developing countries, often shot with two different endings. In particular, the version of Animal Farm that was widely shown has both a realistic ending and an ending that shows the rising up of the working animals against tyrannical pigs. By the same token, 1984, the Columbia Pictures version of 1956 features not only an ending faithful to the book, but also a different ending in which Winston and Julia don rebel outfits, with Winston firing as a sniper against attacking thought police agents coming in from all directions. He and Julia perish in the attempt, but as heroic freedom fighters, not as helpless zombies, brainwashing in 101. Clearly, these attempts by the American intelligence services represented Cold War efforts to turn the tide against Soviet attempts to overturn American interests in the developing world and attempts to launch revolutionary activities that would be hostile to American capitalism or Western interests. All this is part of the controversial and ambiguous legacy in Orwell's afterlife. Both famous and infamous, but without a doubt the leading literary Cold Warrior of the 20th century. Prophecies are uncertain, but one thing does seem likely. Public interest in Orwell's work will continue to remain high. Scholarly attention will not abate. Whether the 21st century witnesses anything comparable to the extraordinary fact that in late 1983, early 1984, Orwell's final book sold more than 2 million copies within a series of weeks. The first book ever published decades earlier to rise to #1 on world bestseller lists, let alone to dominate it for weeks and weeks. Nothing like this may happen again in the 21st century. But Orwell's dream of becoming and remaining a famous author seems well assured.